Okay, so just want to go back very briefly to the title of As I Lay Dying. As you guys know, the title is taken from the Odyssey, Book 11, and it is Agamemnon has gone to the underworld, and Odysseus has gone to the underworld, and he's talking to Agamemnon, who's telling him about the circumstances of his death and his murder by his wife Clytemnestra. So as I lay dying, the woman with the dog's eye would not close my eyes as I descended into Hades. So this is the original inspiring moment in many ways for Faulkner. And today I'd like to talk a little more about the whole of modernism and the epic tradition. And obviously we've read enough of As I Lay Dying to know that this is in many ways an epic journey, right? It is a journey, very heroic, a mock heroic journey to bury Addie. So it has all the trappings of the epic. It's an epic journey on a small scale. And is also taking advantage of two epic conventions. We've seen just now that we hear the voice of the dead, and that's a very important epic convention, both in Homer and in Dante. And as we'll see, it is also a very important convention in As I Lay Dying as well, that Faulkner is making very liberal use of. The other interesting epic convention that I think is being invoked in As I Lay Dying is the uncertain boundaries between the human and the non-human. And we have already actually seen a little bit of that. So just want to refresh your memory with something that we discussed last time in terms of the two kinds of speech, right? Last week we talked about the social dialect on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the words with secrets. And this is one instance of words with secrets coming from Vardaman. So this is Vardaman talking about something in the barn after he has beaten Peabody's horses and broken the stake. It is as though the dog were resolving him out of his integrity into an unrelated scattering of components, snuffings and stamping, smells of cooling flesh and ammoniate hair, an illusion of a coordinated whole of splotch high and strong bones within which drench and secret and familiar and is different from my is. Most likely, Vardaman is talking about the horse, but as we can see, especially as we get closer to the end of that passage, this being that is drenched and secret and familiar and is different from my is. Vardaman seems to be talking really more about his brother, Jewel, than about Jewel's horse. And it's really hard to say when the human ends and when the animal begins in that particular passage. So this is something that we see both in a kind of a small moment like this in As I Lay Dying, but also in a very dramatized moment when Vardaman says, "My mother is a fish," where obviously a strong analogy is being established between human and non-human. We'll come back to that statement on Thursday, but today I'd like to just to go back a little bit and give you a sense of this very long epic tradition behind As I Lay Dying by going back to Homer and Dante. And in Homer, I want to talk about two instances. The Cyclops, obviously, we don't know if he's fully human, and an even more famous episode is Circe turning humans into animals, and then Dante following through with that convention in the Inferno when humans are turned into animals as punishment. So first of all, Homer in Book 9 of the Odyssey, Odysseus and his men are trapped inside a cage by the Cyclops, and the way that they try to escape is by blinding the Cyclops, Polyphemus. And so this is a moment that is reproduced by just about all the painters who paint that scene, that episode in the Odyssey, is the blinding of the eye, and we know that Cyclops only has one eye. So it's relatively easy. They only have to do it once. So here's Odysseus blinding the eye of the Cyclops. And we can see that the Cyclops seems bigger. The main difference seems to be in size and also the amount of hair on him. But otherwise, he's a human form. But we also know that he's different, if only because his one eye is in the center of his forehead. So he's not quite human, but he's close enough. And that is a condition that is especially fascinating to epic authors. Just give you a couple more images of the Cyclops. Basically, it's the same kind of idea. He's much larger, has a lot more hair, but otherwise has a recognizable human form. All the men trying to use that spike to blind the Cyclops, and here is one more image. So it's pretty much, there seems to be kind of consensus in thinking about Cyclops that he really basically is like us. But what is also interesting is that after his eye has been blinded, the Cyclops wants to make sure that when his sheep leave the cage that there wouldn't be humans hiding or going along with them. So he's counting all his sheep as they go out, as they leave the cage, even though his cave, even though he can't really see them. And he's surprised that his favorite sheep is the last to go, and he's the last to go because Odysseus is clinging to him. But this is what Cyclops says to his sheep: "Sweet cousin ram, why lag behind the rest in the night cave? You never linger so, but graze before them all, and go afar to crop sweet grass, and take your stately way, leading along the streams until at evening you come to be the first one in the fold. Why now so far behind? Can you be grieving over your master's eye?" So this is not only is a sense of kinship between the Cyclops and his sheep, but this is one of the earliest moments of cross-species identification, that the Cyclops obviously is mourning the loss of his eye, and he's projecting that grief onto his sheep and recreating kinship on a different level, not just on the physical level, there's a connection between humans and animals, but also on the psychic level, on an emotional level, there is that kind of kinship. So the Odyssey, I would say, is one of the earliest moments of a really interesting kind of cross-species imagination, at least in this one moment. The more better-known moment, and actually I would argue is less subtle than this, is the transformation of humans by Circe, and here's Odysseus going after her because she's transformed one of his men into this animal. So we see many instances of this, and this is an amazing image, this kind of vessel with all the animals in Circe's house, and I think that we recognize that actually there's a strong Egyptian influence. This images look very Egyptian, and there is in fact constant traffic between Greece, ancient Greece, and Egypt. So it's part of the impetus for thinking about humans and non-humans is coming from Egypt as well. And here's just to complete our discussion of the epic tradition that Dante is doing the same thing. And I just want to alert you that the snake is very important. The connection between the human and the non-human in the Inferno is that Dante's basic punitive philosophy is that humans get punished by being changed into something that resembles the crime. So thieves, because they're sneaky and they sneak their way into other people's dwellings and take what belongs to them, that thieves are turned into snakes in the Inferno. So lots of snakes in the Inferno, and one more dramatic representation. All of these are by William Blake. So we kind of have a really interesting conjunction of a 19th century author going back to Dante and reproducing these very emblematic moments. So we have on record a 19th century author, William Blake, being inspired by the epic tradition. And I think the Faulkner is a 20th century instance of a similar kind of inspiration. But as with Faulkner, he adds another layer of complexity to the epic tradition. And I would say that this is actually one of the most important innovations in As I Lay Dying. In many ways more interesting than the epic journey itself, is that humans are rarely identified with just one kind of animal. More often, they are pulled between two ends of a spectrum. They are sometimes identified with one, and sometimes identified with the other, and sometimes it's a mixture of the two. So the two characters that I would like to talk about in that context first of all Tull, and then Jewel. Tull is a minor character, but in many ways he's a really good example to concentrate on, to try to get a sense of the basic narrative strategies in Faulkner. So I would just like to stop here for a moment and talk about possible paper topics when you think of the upcoming long paper. Is to focus on minor characters. It is counterintuitive to use minor characters as the main subject of your papers, but actually I promise you, especially in the case of Faulkner, you can get wonderful papers by focusing on someone like Tull, or even someone like Cora, very unobvious entry point, but because they are unobvious entry points, you can actually end up writing really interesting and surprising and compelling papers. So I'll try to give you a demonstration today of what could be done by focusing on a minor character like Tull, and then obviously moving on to a more central character, Jewel. So I would like to argue that Tull is basically identified with two opposing kinds of animal. One is the mule, the indispensable animal among poor whites, the mule rather than the horse, and then a creature that also makes a routine appearance in Faulkner, the buzzard. So first of all, the mule and how as mule-like. When I look back at my mule, it was like he was one of these spy glasses, and I could look at him standing there and see all the broad land, and my house sweated out of it, like it was the more the sweat, the broader the land. The more the sweat, the tighter the house, because it would take a tight house for Cora to hold Cora like a jar of milk in the spring. You've got to have a tight jar, or you need a power spring. So if you have a big spring, why then you have the incentive to have tight, well-made jars, because it is your milk, sour or not, because you would rather have milk that was sour than to have milk that won't, because you are a man. I have no idea what he's talking about. This is really, I think maybe it's just the sound of it that Faulkner wants us to get the flavor of thoughts that might have been coursing through Tull's head. It's just a wonderful moment talking about manhood among poor white people who don't have a lot to prove their manhood with, right? No fast, no cars, no iPhones, nothing. So very poor equipment with which to prove your manhood. And the only thing that Tull can use is just his mule. And so he's looking at his mule. And by looking at his mule, somehow his thoughts meander to the most important person in his life, his wife, Cora. And that is his claim to Cora. So I won't be able to tell you, the exact logic behind this little bit of reasoning, which is really more emotional reasoning than cerebral reasoning. But it seems that Tull is saying that his claim to Cora, the way that he can keep her in a tight house, both in the physical house, but also in a tight place in his heart and in her heart, is by being a very good laborer, by sweating and cultivating the land, and making sure that the more the sweat, the tighter the house, right? So this is the logic, that this is the nature of manhood among poor whites, is that it is by the sweat of your brow that you can win the woman's heart. You know, it's nothing fancy, nothing complicated, very simple logic. But of course it doesn't come out in a simple way in Faulkner. And that really is kind of the defining nature of the existence of very poor rural people, is that basically you only have one thing to prove yourself. And we can see that why on this one thing ends as such an inadequate specimen of masculinity. It's just not a very good workman. So Tull is, by contrast, someone who is fully adequate, fully competent, fully impressive specimen of manhood in that particular environment. And he's very proud. You know, this is a very joyful moment. This is one of the great scenes about marriage. And on Thursday, we'll talk about a contrasting scene of a very bad marriage, contrasting with this very happy scene of a married couple in Faulkner. But as with Faulkner, mules don't stay happy forever, or humans that are like mules don't stay happy forever. So we're turning to a different meaning of the muse when the journey takes both an epic but also a tragic turn when they try to cross the river when the bridge is gone. And the muse are supposed to pull the cart across the river, which they know they cannot do. So they're just looking at this impending disaster. And once again, the muse is emblematic of people who know that something terrible is going to happen, but with absolutely no power to stop that from happening. The muse stand, the four quarters already sloped a little, the rungs high. They too are breathing now with a deep groaning sound. Looking back once, the gaze sweeps across us with in their eyes a wild, sad, profound, and despairing quality, as though they had already seen in the thick water the shape of the disaster, which they could not speak and we could not see. So I think the epic convention is, in fact, the entire ancient Greek tradition is invoked in two ways, both in the muse as, in many ways, emblematic of humans, but also in the function of a tragic chorus, right? You know that this is a structural feature in Greek tragedy, chorus looking on, knowing that a catastrophe is about to hit, but with absolutely no ability to prevent its coming. So that's what the muse are doing here. That's the function, that's the epic function within the Saleh dying. Very much associated with a kind of resigned but resilient attitude that we've seen in Tull. But in this case, the resignation and the kind of personal bravery, that those two qualities aren't really adequate to stopping the arrival of a catastrophe. So in the next moment, we sort of see what happens to the muse, and this is in many ways simply a logical conclusion of what they have already been aware of. This is a completely unsurprising ending to the sequence begun by the muse as the tragic chorus. Between two hills, I see the muse once more. They roll up out of the water in succession, turning completely over, the legs stiffly extended, as when they had lost contact with the earth. So this is in many ways a backward gesture to that earlier happy moment when the muse are fully contented and fully capable of doing what they can do within their own environment. Muse are creatures with feet of clay. That's what's clear in this kind of sequence, is that because they are creatures with feet of clay, they can only survive when they are on solid earth. And when they are on solid earth, they are very good in making that earth productive and reproductive. So this is really what Tull is talking about. He's a very productive farmer. He's also reproductively happy with Cora. That is the nature, but also the limit of a mule-like existence, is that there are certain lines that mules cannot cross. They cannot transcend their own condition. As creatures with feet of clay, they can only be okay, and it really is no more than that. They can be okay only within one setting. And in this other moment, when they've left the customary setting, and they're stuck trying to negotiate with a swollen river, we know that the mules will not survive in that kind of transformed setting. So in many ways, a perfect analogy for the poor whites, that they can do relatively well when they're left to their own devices, when they allow simply to stick to the environment. But once they're taken out of that environment, then we know that terrible things are going to happen to them. So in this particular sequence, Tull being associated with the muse, he's basically defenseless. He wants just to be allowed to live life according to his own fashion. That really is the basic requirement of the muse, is to be let alone and to be allowed to just to survive as they know how to do. That is a very innocuous and in many ways a very sad portrait of the poor whites, but basically innocuous. But Faulkner really also has a somewhat different image of what a poor white community might amount to. And so he's not just going to give us an image of poor whites as defenseless, but basically non-aggressive, right? Views are completely non-aggressive. Faulkner does think that there actually is an element of aggression in a very close-knit community, especially a close-knit community such as the poor white community. And we see that in the next image of the poor whites, coming from, not surprisingly, from Jew. This is how Jew thinks about his neighbors. And now them others sitting there like buzzards, waiting, fanning themselves, every bastard in the country coming in to stare at her. We've talked about hatred as a very important emotion, as a kind of emotional bond within the family. And we now see that hatred is also a very important emotional bond within a small, isolated community. Not only does Jew hate someone like Tull, because they always think they're watching your every move, not only does Jew hate Tull, but he also imagines that there is an element of aggression, something that is not quite benign coming from the neighbors. And that is really why he's so suspicious of them and so ill-disposed towards them on his part. The buzzards actually will appear over and over again. We've already seen them in The Sound of the Fury, the buzzards collecting around the body of the dog Nancy in the ditch, and buzzards that Benji imagines will go and undress his dead grandmother. So buzzards have already appeared in Faulkner, but in As I Lay Dying, buzzards as a physical presence would be quite important, and also as a metaphoric presence to talk about what your neighbors might really be like in their hearts, not in the outward behavior, but in their hearts they might be just like buzzards. And here's an image of the buzzards to explain why Jew might think that the neighbors are like them. So Tull, as I said, is obviously not the main protagonist in As I Lay Dying, but he is an important clue to what Faulkner is trying to do, because the way Faulkner portrays Jewel, a very important character, is almost exactly analogous to the way he portrays Tull, except that what in Tull is dispersed and sequenced. Tull is sometimes identified with the mule and sometimes identified with the buzzard. We don't actually see him being simultaneously identified with both. What is sequenced and spaced out in Tull would quite often be collapsed together as one in Faulkner's portrait of Jewel. So in this moment, we actually see Jewel being likened to two animals, not just one, not just his horse, which is obviously the main creature that he's affiliated with, not just the horse, but something else. "Come here, sir," Jewel says. He moves. Moving that quick, his coat bunching, tongue swirling like so many flames. With tossing mane and tall and rolling eye, the horse makes another short curvetting rush and stops again, feet bunch, watching Jewel. Jewel walks steadily toward him, his hands at his sides. Save for Jewel's legs, they are like figures carved for a tableau savage in the sun. When Jewel can almost touch him, the horse stands on his hind legs and slashes mane of hooves as by an illusion of wings among them. Beneath the up-rear chest, he moves with the flashing limberness of a snake. For an instant, before the jerk comes into his arms, he sees his whole body, earth-free, horizontal, whipping snake limber until he finds the horse's nostrils and touches earth again. So many things to say about this moment. The first, and with reference back to the Mules and the fact that they are creatures of clay, is that Faulkner is basically making a very deep metaphoric distinction between two kinds of animals. There are animals like the Mules who can swim and who can only survive when they are on solid earth. And then there are other creatures, the horse being the main example, who actually can leave the earth for a non-trivial length of time and be able to survive when they're not touching the earth. So right here we know that Jewel is a very different kind of person from Tull. Yes, he is in a poor white community. His parents appear to be poor whites, but for some reason there is something else about Jewel that makes him different. He's more horse-like than mule-like. So this is a kind of a backward reference to another important animal in As I Lay Dying, but within the compass of this particular passage, what is really interesting is the simultaneous co-presence of the horse and the snake. And for most of us, the two of them actually really are not that alike. I mean, it's hard to think of any kind of kinship really between the horse and the snake. They look different and they have very different connotations, in our common understanding of those two animals. So let's try to see what it is that enables Faulkner to bring those two animals together. Well, I mean, we know that the horse is a winged horse. So this is going back to the epic traditions and illusion with wings. This is not just a horse that is an earthly creature, but seemingly one of the winged horses of Greek mythology. And certainly the horse is acting like a mythic horse in that the motion is almost beyond just the physical capability of any earthly creature. So it is the body in motion, but not being registered as body at all, but simply as bodily parts coming into view when suddenly you're seeing that bodily part, but not really the entire horse. And that actually was the way that Vardaman was thinking of the horse as well, right? If we go back to that moment, in Vardaman's representation of the horse in the barn, it was as though the dog were resolving him out of his integrity into an unrelated scattering of components, snuffings and stampings, smells of cooling flesh and ammonia air, and so on. So Vardaman has exactly the same kind of scatter representation. The horse is moving so fast that we're not actually seeing the horse as a single integrated being, but simply as different bodily parts coming into view through the motion. So really it's less about the body, less about the horse's body, than about a kind of very fast, almost transcendent kind of motion. And that is really what how Jules' horse is represented to us. We don't see him as a horse, we simply see him as something that is in constant motion. But more than that, it is the very ambiguous relation between Jules and the horse. Obviously, Jules loves his horse. You know, he's done a lot of work to get the horse. It is very much his horse. But it is not exactly an affectionate relation, right? It is a battle between two creatures very important to each other. The horse probably is the most important creature to Jules, but there's no affection there. So what is the feeling, what is the emotional bond between these two things if it is not common affection, which is the most ordinary and easily recognizable and recognized human bond, is not there? What is this other emotion that is there? And it seems that what Faulkner is suggesting is that instead of the common human affection, it is a snake-like quality that is binding Jules to his horse. We don't know what emotions snakes have. They're not credited with having emotions other than sneakiness, which isn't really an emotion. So we don't actually know what kind of emotional bonds can come from snakes, aggression or maybe some degree of hatred. But that is a kind of a general thing. It's not a benign feeling, that's for sure. So right now, let's just say that we don't completely understand what is going on here, or why the snake is a very important supplement to the relation between Jules and the horse. We're back once again to what we've been talking about earlier, which is the narrative as a secret-bearing narrative, right? This is not social dialect, this is words with secrets. That's what we're seeing right here. And just to highlight how unusual this description of Jules and the horse is, just want to go back very briefly to a contrasting moment in Hemingway, when once again we see a human pair with an animal that is very important to him in our time. This is the matador killing the bull. When he started to kill it, it was all in the same rush. The bull looking at him straight in front, hating. The bull charged and Velarde charged, and just for a moment they became one. Velarde became one with the bull, and then it was over. In this passage in Hemingway, actually the emotion of hatred is quite important as well. So in an odd way, just like Faulkner, Hemingway is also interested in hatred as a powerful emotional bond. And that really is what enables the bullfight to go on. But it is hatred so clear and so transparent and so ritualistic and so ceremonious that it is also transformed by that ritual into a kind of love, really. So in Hemingway, it is very, very clear. It's the clarity of the sentiment that is in the foreground. There's really nothing more to say. The bull and the matador have become one. Hemingway keeps repeating that. Everything is completely clear, and there is no secret whatsoever. By contrast, this is a secretive narrative that flaunts its secret in our face. We don't really understand what's going on, and that is the purpose of this kind of narration. So just to refresh your memory, we're drawing inspiration from Frank Camus' classic Genesis of Secrecy. And the moment where Faulkner is highlighting and dramatizing the existence of a secret is by way of Jules' horse. And this time is a fully dramatized moment in the sense that not only is the horse there, not only is Jules there, but everyone else is there. So the entire tragic chorus, or maybe in this case not completely tragic either, but the entire chorus is there witnessing this dramatic exchange, and it is no longer an exchange between Jules and the horse, but someone else. Jules, Ma said, looking at him, I'll give, give. Then she began to cry. She cried hard, not hiding her face, standing there in her faded wrapper, looking at him and him on the horse, looking down at her, his face growing cold, though sick looking, until he looked away quick, and Cash came and touched her. You go on to the house, Cash said. This here ground is too wet for you. You go on now. That night, I found Ma sitting beside the bed where he was sleeping in the dark. She cried hard, maybe because she had to cry so quiet, maybe because she felt the same way about tears she did about deceit, hating herself for doing it, hating him because she had to. And then I knew that I knew. I knew that as plain as on the day I knew about Dewey Dow. So this is the moment when the secret is exposed. And it is exposed, of course, without Faulkner ever coming close to the very simple nature of that secret. It is completely by way of this detour around Jules' horse. The way we know that there is a secret is that Addie's response to the horse is nothing like what would have been a normal response to a horse. Sun disappears night after night. You know, people don't know where he goes. And then all of a sudden he comes back with his horse. An unheard of possession among poor ways. Mules would be the standard animals to have for poor ways. A horse is not at all the thing to have, or that anyone could have. So this is a possession that is inappropriate for poor ways. Vardaman's response is what would have been an ordinary, completely understandable response, is let me ride a horse. So Vardaman is reacting as anyone would react. Addie's response is by crying, which I guess could still have been normal, except that the response then from Jules is that his face is growing cold. And then he's looking at her, and the more he looks at her, the more sick looking he becomes. So that is not in the script at all. If the horse had been anything but a good event, right? If the horse had simply been a joyous acquisition, none of this would have happened. So what is it that transforms a joyous acquisition into something that people can either cry about or be very uneasy about, or something that requires some degree of comforting, which is what Cash seems to be doing. Here is this proud mother, and Addie ought to be a proud mother. And instead, Cash is talking to her as if something terrible had happened to her. Go on back to the house. Go on now. The ground is too wet for you. The solicitude coming from Cash is also inexplicable. So we can say that from every single person, the overreaction of Addie, the crying, the sick-looking expression on Jules' face, the over-solicitude coming from Cash, all of those things are things that should not be in the script, but surprisingly are in the script. And then we know that there really is something that could be named, that could be identified and named. And even though Dow is not going to name it for us, he comes as close as he can to saying that word. So the way he tells us is that I knew that as plain on that day as I knew about do it tell. So right here, we see a kind of backward reproduction in terms of Faulkner's characterization. We know about Dewey Dell's pregnancy out of wedlock first, right? And this is the thing that Dell knows about, its transparent secret. It is Dewey Dell's out of wedlock pregnancy that is being reproduced in her mother. This is the kind of interesting backward reproduction, like mother, like daughter. And in this case, we know about the daughter's condition first, and it's because Dell has exactly the same reaction now and exactly the same degree of knowledge now that we know that, in fact, what Dewey Dell is doing now has been done once before in the family by her mother. So a lot of things are hanging together. The fact that Jewel has a very different height that can be explained. The fact that Jewel can acquire a horse when nobody else in the poor white community, that can be explained as well. A lot of things are falling into place with a suspicion that's not just sneaking up on us. And I think that this is really why the snake is so important to Faulkner, is that a discovery is sneaking up on us. It is sneaking up on everyone else. This is a snake that is not like the snake in Dante, a snake that takes the possession of someone else, although there's an element of this as well, but a snake that insinuates itself into our consciousness and imparts to us a degree of knowledge or a kind of knowledge that maybe we would prefer not to have. So this is really the very early snake, the snake that is the bearer of knowledge coming to Adam and Eve, that is being invoked here. And it's just to clinch the case, just to make everything very, very clear, Faulkner now resorts to another epic convention, bringing Addie back to life so that she actually gets to say something. And there is no other explanation other than the license, the poetic license, afforded by the epic form that would allow for a completely non-realistic representation of the voice of a dead person in an otherwise realistic novel. But that is the poetic license that Faulkner is taking. So in a very, very strange moment, basically at the very heart of As I Lay Dying, we see the voice of Addie addressing us and talking about a past moment in her life. I would think of sin as I would think of the clothes we both wore in the world's face, of the circumspection necessary because he was he and I was I. The sin, the more utter and terrible, since he was the instrument ordained by God who created the sin, to sanctify that sin he had created. While I waited for him, in other words, waiting for him because he saw me before he saw me, I would think of him as dressed in sin, he the more beautiful, since the garment which he had exchanged for sin was sanctified. It's and a confession, I guess, as close to a confession as we can get about the paternity of Jewel. But that confession about the paternity of Jewel is characteristically couched in terms of a strange kind of satisfaction that Addie gets from this particular kind of affair, which is that the garment that her partner in sin has exchanged for that sin is actually all the more beautiful because it is sanctified by God. So that tells us who the Father is, right? Faulkner is being tongue-in-cheek here. The father, we figure out, is probably Whitfield. He's the only likely candidate. There's really no one else in that small community who could be the father. So there could only be one. But it turns out that Faulkner actually has taken his name from a historic figure, a very influential preacher, 18th century preacher Benjamin Franklin said that when he would go to hear Whitfield, he would make sure that he would have very little money on his person, because he just know that he would empty out his pockets when Whitfield goes around and asks for donations. And sure enough, even though he takes very little money with him, he always walks away with empty pockets after Whitfield is done. So that's a very powerful, one of the most famous preachers of the 18th century. And Faulkner has recreated this preacher, but with a twist in As I Lay Dying, and this is his Whitfield. It was his hand that bore me safely above the flood, that fended me from the dangers of the waters. My horse was frightened, and my own heart failed me as the logs and the uprooted trees bore down upon my littleness, but not my soul. I knew then that forgiveness was mine, the flood, the danger behind, and as I rode on across the firm earth. So the Bundrens are unable to cross the swollen river. The Mules drown in the river. One person is able to cross the river because his horse is able to cross the river. So this is the genealogy of the horse, both as horse, but obviously also as snake as well. The full spectrum of meanings of the creature snake revealed to us in pieces, and that is really the nature of the narrative, right? That we don't actually get the whole creature all at once. We see different bodily parts coming to view with the motion of this creature. And with this finally established kinship between Jules' horse and Whitfield's horse, in this case a very well-behaved horse, not at all like the wild horse of Jules, which also explains why Whitfield is a minister, whereas Jules is nothing like that. So it's the wildness in the offspring that actually backward reproduces the mostly law-abiding but not completely law-abiding identity of the father. And just to add to that, here is Tao observing everything, and this is the clearest indication that the animal for Whitfield is also the horse. On the horse, he rode up to AMST and came back on the horse. It's almost too heavy-handed to emphasize this detail over and over again. And it would have been completely uncalled for, except for the fact that we really need to have a narrative genealogy for Jules, and it is a narrative genealogy that is told actually not only through a human story, not only through the monologue of Addie in this epic convention of the dead speaking, but it's also told a parallel epic convention of a human story threaded through a non-human creature.